Okay, this one here is about my probably 10th great-grandfather or grandfather, whatever you call it, that was the third patron of Staten Island. His name was Cornelius Milne. He, his daughter, Susanna, or Santa, they call her, was married to John Winans, who was from, this is way back there. This is before the Canary Island people came here. This was 1600, like 1621, something like that. So the Winans have been here on this New World since, I think it's like 376 years. So we've served under lots of flags, many flags. And the Dutch, before the Dutch flag, it was the West Indies Company. That was the flag. And I don't know if yeah, these are the West Indies companies. And this guy, Milne, that's him standing there. He bought or purchased a lot of stuff on Staten Island. Well, he was given, he had to buy it though. You know, you had to buy these patronships, or whatever you call them, impresarios, and whenever the Republic of Texas started, and Henry Castro, and those guys, Austin, Stephen F. Austin, Moses Austin, they were impresarios, which is, to me, has always just been a fancy name for a real estate agent, you know, because that's what they were. They were just realtors that were getting people to come to their colony. Well, this man started a colony in with people from the Netherlands, and they came over to the New World for the fur trade. That's why I've got a beaver here. The beaver was the big thing, you know, in those days. Fur, and I'm passing around this. When I used to be a trapper up in Alaska, so I know a little bit about the fur trade. But we did it humanely. But that's a joke. His property, it shows in this book. This is the book where I've got most of this information. But I also went on the web today, and just all these people are talking, or have web things about him. And he took 12 or 13, 12 voyages across the Atlantic Ocean on ships like this little thing here. And so he must have been a good seaman to go 12 voyages back and forth. That's a pretty long ways. And those ships in those days were probably not much longer than this room, I don't know. But maybe 3 or 4 times longer. But if you've ever seen ocean waves, they're big. And there was a lot of problems with the natives, because what these people introduced to them was whiskey. And he started the first distillery in, brandy distillery, brandy wine, or whatever they call it. And so they taught the Indians how to get drunk, so they could take advantage of them. You know, same old story all throughout history. Here comes the Europeans, and just like Cortez in Mexico, just like, you know, wherever they go, they destroy everything. And they take advantage of the silly people and look down on them. You notice they're always standing up, and the natives are always kneeling to them. Well, this particular painting is in some city borough in New York. But anyway, his property was at the corner. Some of his property was at the corner of Broadway and Stone Street. So that's where all these, you know, all these buildings are right now. But he had a lot of trouble with the governor. And
Who was he at this time, the governor?
the governor was Peter Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant. How do you say it? Stuyvesant. And another one was named Keefe. And they didn't like him because he was in control of too much for a long time. So they were always trying to get even with him. So I think that's why a lot of these Indian problems started. It's because this massacre right here, one of these governors took a bunch of men and 2 sleeping villages. They went and massacred everybody there, about 110 Native Americans. So the Native Americans, there was 20 tribes in that area. They started taking revenge on all the farmers and within their reach. So all these, I think it was 2,500 people ended up dying because of these conflicts that were. They even had one guy, one time, he saw this Indian woman taking some peaches off of his tree. He shot her, killed her. So that started what they call the Peach War. Because those, you know, I mean, think about it. Shoot somebody over a peach? But anyway, many people died because of their stupidity. You know, that's just my own personal opinion. But this is the book. Y'all can pass it around a little bit. And I've traced a lot of this back to almost 1100 over in Europe, and eventually there's a connection with that goes over to this Winans over here, who was Ross Winans, who was he built railroads and well, he built locomotives actually, and he and his sons built the roadway between when the Tsar, I forgot which Tsar it was, Nicholas, I think. They built the railroad from St. Petersburg to Moscow. And supposedly, I'm going to skip back and forth, by the way, I'm not going to do this chronologically. Supposedly the Tsar had a map, and he took his sword, which was a straight sword, and he drew a line from St. Petersburg to Moscow and said that's the way he wanted the railroad to go. So the only engineers that would tackle it was George Whistler and Winans. Whistler and Winans, you know, Whistler's mother, okay, that was his son, George's son. So, so there was a connection from these people that went, so these people came over here, our people went back over there, and supposedly Russia had to sell Alaska because of the Winans. They owed the Winans so much money for building that railroad, and they paid them in golden rubles. In those days, it was all gold, no paper money. So supposedly the next Tsar that came in was so indebted that he had to sell Alaska to the United States for like, I think, 2 cents an acre. I mean, some ridiculous price. But as I study this history, it just goes back and forth, you know. And back in the 60s, when I was being, you know, you hear about these people that if they have any kind of connections with anything, the FBI gets on them. Well, they were after me, and I didn't understand why they were so interested in me, but I'd worked for the government in Alaska in 61, 63, and I'd worked for, it was like Air America, only it was called Civil Air Transport, and I didn't understand the connections that they were putting together. And my ex-wife had just come back, this was 1967, and she worked for the first international law firm that started doing business with Russia. And in those days, the United States business people that's just when they first started having business with Russia. And they wouldn't pay them, they wouldn't take rubles because they were paper. So they paid them in industrial diamonds and stuff like that. So my ex-wife had been married to a newsman, a guy that was one of those guys, Mr. President, you know, that sits out in front. So when she came back to me, he sicked the dogs on me, and Los Perros, we used to call them, downtown San Antonio. And so then I started looking at some of this stuff and thinking, wow, you know, that's what they were putting all this, they were dreaming up all this stuff, you know, like, he must be, you know, because see, I was trained by the government in Alaska for certain things, and but anyway, history is strange. But let me bounce to something else that Abraham Clark, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, his mother was Hannah Winans, and so all these Winans come from Jan and Susanna Mell. All the Winans that you see up here. There was a Medal of Honor winner. There was a Major General Edwin B. Winans, Winans Road out of here at Fort Sam Houston. That was named after him. Here's Edwin B. Winans, the governor twice of Michigan. Here's James J. Winans, member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Ohio. Here's another one, John Winans, member of the House of Representatives from Wisconsin. Here's Roswell Winans, who won the Medal of Honor during the Dominican War. He was a Major General. All these different generals. But this guy over here was written out of history because he backed the Confederacy. He was from Maryland, and he was a secessionist. And Abraham Lincoln was a railroad lawyer. And when they arrested Ross Winans, who was one of the richest men on earth at that time, he was a very wealthy man, they put him at Fort McHenry in prison. And in fact, the whole legislative body, they arrested the whole group, took them to Fort McHenry. I read a deal where Abraham Lincoln had made a deal with Ross to sign a promise, whatever you want to call it, that he would not use his wealth against the Union, and he signed it. But his sons were over in Russia building the railroad at that time. But this, I just learned about him as an adult. There's nothing in any textbook that I ever saw about Ross Winans. Ross Winans, you remember 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea? You see this vehicle, I mean this watercraft here? He designed it. He designed this, and the guy that wrote Nautilus, H.G., who was it, H.G. Wells? Or I forgot who it was. Anyway, this boat was parked at the docks in England where he stayed. So I'm sure he used this steel. It was called the Winans Cigar Ship. But he also invented all these locomotives. He worked with the guy that did the first. They called it the Tom Thumb. It was the first steam locomotive. Well, Ross and Tom built this. They call it the Tom Thumb. And there was also a steam gun, the Winans steam gun they called it. He was given credit for it, but it wasn't really his invention. This guy that actually invented it had sent it to his locomotive machine shop to have work done on it. So when the Union soldiers came to Baltimore, there was a riot in Baltimore just before the war, the Civil War. And they confiscated that. This looks like the first army tank to me. It's like a, but instead of shooting with gunpowder, it's shot with steam, like compressed boom, you know. And supposedly it would be on rails if they ever used it. But I don't think it was ever used in any kind of war. But so Abraham Clark was, he was a guy, he was a very, very interesting man. He was not one of these fancy pants guys. And he was the only child of, Abraham Clark was born in Elizabethtown, New Jersey in 1726. The only child of Thomas Clark and Hannah Winans, who they were married in 1724. The signer's paternal grandparents were Elizabethtown residents. Abraham's mother, Hannah, came from a family long in residence in the Elizabethtown area. Hannah's parents were Samuel Winans and Sir Zerviah, however you say that, Carrera or Vernia. Abraham's maternal great-grandparents, John Winans and Susanna Meln. Okay, back here to the Melns. Married in New Haven, Connecticut in August of 1664. John Winans, who immigrated from Holland, was one of the 80 associates that founded Elizabethtown in 1664. Over 150 Winans family members are buried in the cemetery adjacent to the First Presbyterian Church in present-day Elizabeth, New Jersey, where the Clark and Winans families worshipped. Cornelius Meln took the oath of fidelity with 29 others when he settled in New Haven, Connecticut, because I think the English had taken it back. And when he settled in, Abraham Clark married Sarah Hatfield in 1748. It is said that Sarah was an intrepid and resourceful woman whose industry allowed her husband the opportunity for decades of public service. Maybe she's rich, I don't know. Sarah was the eldest daughter of Isaac Hatfield and Sarah Price. But during the war, or during the Revolution, the American Revolution, Abraham and Sarah had 10 children during their marriage. Aaron Clark was the eldest and served as second lieutenant and captain during the Revolution. Aaron had married Susanna Winans, daughter of Captain Benjamin Winans, in 1775, and after the Revolution moved to Washington. If you've ever heard of the British prison ships that were out in the harbor of New York, what they were huge old ships that had just sank down into the mud, and the British used them as places to kill American prisoners without killing them. They would starve them to death. They'd put them on these ships and starve them to death. Okay, many thousands died that way over the period of time, and that's why I wasn't real jumping up and down about a royal wedding the other day, sorry. It says 2 of Clark's sons who the British had incarcerated on the Jersey prison ships, they had taken one of them, I've read this somewhere else, and they put him, like, they had a thing against him because his father was a rebel, Abraham Clark. And they put this guy in what they called a closet, but it was under a stairwell going up in the ship. It was like a little small room, and they were going to starve him to death. But his friends, all his buddies, would come by. They were chewing. They had to cook their own food, and they'd give them this rotten pork and all this nasty food to eat. These guys would chew up food, and they'd walk by and shove the food through a keyhole for him to survive on. And he survived just by that little bit of food being shoved through by his buddies. And when George Washington heard about this, there was two sons of Abraham Clark's that were in this prison ship, and both of them were officers. They weren't just regular soldiers, they were officers. And the United States, or the Revolutionary Army, had a bunch of prisoners of British officers too. So Washington got word to him. See, he never told these guys that they're working on the Declaration of Independence and all this stuff. Abraham Clark never told anybody about it. He didn't tell those guys that the British had come to him and said, "We will let your boys go if you will not sign with the rebels." So he never told anybody, but sooner or later, George Washington found out about it. And it says, it is reported Thomas was confined to the dungeon, and the only food given him was pressed through the keyhole of the cell. Well, it wasn't a dungeon, it was just a little closet. His health suffered tremendously, which accounted for his early death. Both Aaron and Thomas served in the Eastern Company, New Jersey State Artillery, under Captain Daniel Neal and Colonel Henry Knox's Regiment Artillery, Continental Artillery and State Battery. The company fought at the battles of Trenton and Princeton. That a cannonball fired by the Neal Artillery Regiment is still lodged in the wall of Nassau Hall at Princeton University. Let's see, I wanted to find out down here where he was finally, George Washington finally was told about it. Okay, another thing, it says, throughout the war, Clark raised supplies for Washington's army. Meanwhile, nearly always present in Congress to vote, many of the remaining Clark letters discussed troop movements and procurement. Clark was one of only 12 men, including Alexander Hamilton, John Dickinson, Edmund Randolph, and James Madison Jr., who attended the Annapolis Convention of 1786 to discuss remedies to the federal government. Anyway, he was concerned about stuff, and one thing that he did, which was passed, was called Clark's Law, which was an act for regulation and sharpening the proceedings of the courts of law. And he didn't like all these lawyers anyway, the wigs and all that stuff. He never wore a wig, like a bunch of them. And it says, Bogan quoted Clark that if it succeeds, it will tear off the ruffles from the lawyer's wrists, a nod to his disdain for pretense. I guess I inherited some of that. In February 1786, the Jersey legislature passed a bill sponsored for Clark, an act to prevent the importation of slaves. That's another thing, the Winans were always abolitionists. Even though they served, this group down here served with the Confederacy, they never had slaves. And to authorize the manumission of them under certain restrictions and to prevent the abuse of slaves. When I was did my master's degree out at UTSA, and most of my professors were northern people, and they always looked down their noses at me because I was part of this Republic of Texas group, you know. But so when I was working on my papers, I had to produce a lot of primary sources, And when we were going through all the census and these microfiche tapes and all this stuff, they were always looking for slaves next to my name, you know, next to my people's name. Never could find one. And once they realized that the Winans had come from New Jersey, that was another feather in my hat. Is, oh, maybe he's okay after all, you know. And but anyways, some of the son-in-laws had slaves, like Jesse Billingsley. You know, my great-grandfather's sister married Jesse Billingsley, who was the guy at San Jacinto, the one that made Sam Houston fight. And but anyway, that's another story. He was Billingsley's Rangers, Billingsley's men. He back in the 1830s, before the Republic started, Billingsley had a group of men that was like a militia from Bastrop. Well, Mina. It was Mina before it was Bastrop. And see, the Mexican government had allowed the Anglo invasion because most of these guys that came here were bloody troops from the Revolutionary War, War of 1812 and stuff like that. So the Mexican government wanted a buffer zone, which were these Anglos against the Comanche, because this was the very end of Comancheria, which was this vast country of the Comanche country. And it was their nation. It was the nation of Comancheria. And so the Mexicans had taken it away from them, this part of it, and so, but they couldn't handle them. These Comanches were like, they were like the lords of the prairie. I mean, on the horseback, they were like the best guerrilla fighters there ever were. And so that's why these Texas Rangers, they call them Prinches here in this area, they spit on the ground usually when they said. But there was a lot of Mexican Rangers. A lot of people don't know that, but there were. But these people out of UTSA were what I call revisionist historians. And what they were doing is they had all these people, like in this one class I had 300 people. You know, there was about 300 people in this introductory class of Texas history. And they portrayed the Anglo as a bunch of drunken, slave-owning, terrible people. And I resented that because I paid a lot of money to go to that school. You know, I got a bachelor's degree from there. I got a master's in education degree. I got a master's in history degree. And I paid a lot of money for all that stuff. And it used to really, of course, I was an older guy when I went back to college. So I used to call them down on stuff. And they didn't like that, you know, because I would do my homework before I got into any kind of debate with them. Clark did not believe men in public office should use their positions to confer favors or members of their personal families. According to Quinn, when his two sons were prisoners of war on the Jersey, he refused to reveal the issue to congressional delegates. Only when other members found out about the treatment of Thomas Clark in the Jersey dungeon did intervention occur. This was actually Washington, General Washington's the one that did this. But neither son escaped the Jersey until the general exchange of prisoners. And here's what Washington told those guys. He said, you know what? He said, we've got a bunch of your officers in prison, and if you don't take those guys out of those conditions, we'll, you know, I'm sure they didn't release all the people out of the ship. They just let them out of the closet, so to speak, because they weren't just automatically released just because they were Abraham Clark's kids. And but anyway, Washington threatened that they would start treating some of their officers the same way that they were treating them. So that's why they did it. The British offered to release Clark's sons if he defected to the Tory side, but he refused. So they kept him just, you know, to punish him. Abraham's son, Captain Thomas Clark, is buried at the site, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the Winans of, and that was Abraham Clark. That, this group here that came in the 1830s to Texas had already been under, let's see, West Indies flag, the Dutch flag, the English flag, the British flag, then the Revolutionary War flag. Then they came here when it was Mexico. That was the Mexico flag. Then the Republic of Texas flag. Then the Texas flag. Then the CSA flag, the Confederacy. And then back to the Union. So that's about 10 flags that they were under. You know, I wish that when I was growing up that I'd known some of this, because my mother kept all this away from me. She knew a bunch of this stuff, but anything to do with her family was what she wanted to hear. My father learned to keep his mouth shut. And I always wondered why, what was the deal? Why, you know? And then so when I grew up and started researching on my own, I started realizing that that Nelson family, they felt that the Winans were too snooty, you know? They were a bunch of rich people. You know, we weren't. But I guess they felt that way. But anyway, I'm not real happy with a lot of the way the history is presented. You know, the winner wins, and they write the history. And they can write you out of history, or they can write you in the history. And most of the history that I read is false. It's not true. A lot of it's not true. And especially the treatment of people, the treatment of minorities, the treatment of women, the treatment of Native Americans, you know. It's like in 1910 when they had a revolution in Mexico, they hired 5,000 special rangers to go down to the border. And they would sit up there on those ledges and they'd pop them as they'd come across and let their bodies float on down the river. And so what they would, no, you never hear this stuff in school. But what they'd do is they'd wait till they'd get their little rafts across with all the stuff that they brought. Then they'd lay them down on the sandbank and then go down there and go through their stuff and get all the, if they were bringing any money or gold or whatever. And no, you don't hear about stuff like that. And when I was a fireman in Kerrville in '67, I heard, you know, I got to know some Texas Rangers. If you look in the back of that book, I know some of the present-day Texas Rangers. But the old-timey Texas Rangers, they were a special group of people that took care of business for the governor, you know. And if they ever got your name in a little black book, they'd mark you off, you know. And but you can't teach the truth. You can't teach the truth to children, you know, not like that. But what you can do is turn on the news and see what's going on in a lot of these countries, you know, like Syria, places like that, where they're just destroying everything. And let's hope that it doesn't happen here. But a lot of people don't want to hear honest. But that's all right. I did a educational book on the Eagle Ford Shale thing that's going on, and I sent Bush one of those, and he liked it.
I agree in a lot of in a lot of what you have to say. There's a very interesting book from Dr. James Lowen, and he agrees with what you said. It's called The Lies My Teacher Told Me. It'll probably be here in your library, but history has been whitewashed.
Oh, sure.
Oh, yeah.
Well, they couldn't tell the truth about this stuff. I mean, you know, it's such, it's like going to church. A lot of this stuff is taught to you, but as soon as people walk out of church, they keep, well, it's in what their heart. Their heart. You know, that's the thing about it, is God can read your heart. You can't hide it from Him.